I'm listening.
Sweetheart, let me handle it.
The Boogeyman is one of the scariest PG-13 movies I have ever seen. I know that PG-13 rating might be a bit of a sort of black mark on The Boogeyman, but don't let that dissuade you from seeing it. Don't let that dissuade you from going out and watching this movie, because it is utterly terrifying, it is frightening, it is horrifying, it is everything you'd want out of a horror movie. It comes from a Stephen King adaptation of his short story, The Boogeyman, from Night Shift from the 70s, and that is a 7-page or 8-page, depending on whatever edition you have, short story. So the challenge of taking that short story and expanding it into a feature film lays on the writers and the director here, Rob Savage, and they pulled it off expertly. It's that building of tension that really makes The Boogeyman special. Rob Savage knows exactly what dials to turn and when to jack up the tension and when to release it and when to hit you with a jump scare. And I know that jump scares are sort of a naughty word in horror movies these days. Everybody hates jump scares. Everybody wants atmosphere. Everybody wants tension. Nobody wants jump scares. Well, this movie has jump scares, and it uses them really well. It uses them in inventive ways, and it uses them in the right spots. It doesn't overuse them. There's plenty of movies out there that overuse jump scares just because they want it to be like a Halloween Horror Nights maze. But this one, it uses them in ways that aid the story. And everything in this film with the scares and the tension and everything adds to those characters, it adds to the story, it adds to the development of the film. It doesn't end up feeling cheap, which is the best part about The Boogeyman. So you might be sitting there thinking, okay, so how do you get an 8-page, 7-page short story into a feature film here? Well, you have the story of a family going through one of the worst things you can imagine for children, and that is their mother dying. So you have Chris Messina playing Will here, you have Sophie Thatcher playing Sadie, you have Vivien Lyra Blair playing Sawyer, a family that has been torn apart by the death of their mother, and each of these characters go through the guilt and the grief in different ways. So Will goes through it and just completely shuts down. He's a therapist, but he doesn't want to go to another therapist to deal with this sort of guilt and grief here. Sophie is a teenager, and she's already sort of an adult at this point, but she goes through the grief and the guilt a little bit differently. She goes through it, she's angry, she's sort of holding on to her mother's possessions like clothes and her art studio. And then, of course, Sawyer is a little young to be dealing with a lot of this stuff, but she goes through it her own ways as well. Now, let's talk about the original short story from Stephen King. It is, 7-8 pages of stuff. And if you haven't read it, sorry, there's spoiler alert here. But it's all about a therapist seeing a patient named Lester Billings. The character is quite an asshole in the short story. Now, in the movie, Lester Billings is played by David Dastmalchian, and he is only in the movie for about a scene or two, but he steals the show. This is an award-worthy performance from Dastmalchian here, and you get this sense of dread throughout the entire time he's talking about his, experience with the Boogeyman, with his 3 children who were killed by the monster, and people don't believe him, and people think he's a murderer. His wife goes crazy, and so he goes to Will to basically find somebody else that can help him with his problem. And it builds and builds and builds through this scene, and you think that Will might be believing him or not believing him or whatever's going on, and then he pulls out the picture that his kid drew of the Boogeyman, and it is bone-chilling, the scene here. Dastmalchian really gives one of the best performances of his career in this film, in this scene in particular. Chris Messina and him are just bouncing off of each other here, and it's just a tennis match of excellent performances from both of them. Throughout the film, there's some other characters as well. There's the sort of teenage assholes that Sadie is friends with. You want that. That's the only thing that I really just didn't care for in the Boogeyman, is you want to see these people get their comeuppance, and they never do. The villain is the monster, but the sub-villain sort of bully characters don't get their comeuppance, and I wanted to see that super bad, but that's just me personally wanting to see bullies get their comeuppance in this world. But the Boogeyman is excellently designed, it's excellently crafted, it has multiple sort of facades and features to it. Some of the scariest scenes in the film are the ones where you don't see the monster. They're the ones where it can mimic people's voices and you think somebody's safe when they're not, and so you go through this whole movie watching and seeing that kind of stuff happen, and it just adds to the overall tension and atmosphere in this film. The Boogeyman is just frightening. It's just a frightening thought. It's a thing that goes into the back of that primal, primordial part of your brain that you can't shake. The fear of the dark that you have, you can't shake. The fear of this monster that could be sitting there in the shadows, and this movie captures that perfectly. There is a section in sort of like that second act, third act area that does drag a little bit of the film down. It isn't there for, you know, just to have somebody show up, but it does feel like it drags a little bit in that section of the film. Outside of that, this movie, I can't find any big flaws. It's just, if you don't like horror movies, you're not going to like this movie. If you like horror movies and you love being scared, I was sitting there the entire time watching through my eyes, you know, squeezing, and it's frightening. It's terrifying. See it in the theater with a bunch of people because it really gets that communal aspect of horror down really well. And so all the people in this film, they really just pull out all the stops, and the Boogeyman ends up being excellent. Also, this is another thing that horror fans out there might be a little bit mad about, but the monster itself is CG. A lot of the effects in this movie are CG. They did try to do as many things as possible with practical effects, but the monster, they said in a press conference and a Q&A with the director, it would have been impossible to do without CGI. Now, like movies like Jaws and Alien, where they show you the monster or they tease the monster as little as possible, this movie does that just as well as they do. It's on screen for a small amount of time, but the presence is felt. The monster is this primordial ancient evil that you have going throughout the film, and it's not your classic boogeyman that you would think, you know, Slender Man or whatever sitting in your closet, but it is a terrifying monster. It is a demonic sort of force of nature that lends itself to some horrific scares in this one. Like, you're not going to be able to sleep with your closet door open after watching this movie. You're going to question everything that you see in the corner of your eye, in the corner. Are those two eyes, or is that the nightlight? It's stuff like that that really sets the Boogeyman apart from other horror films. For Stephen King fans, there are plenty of Stephen King allusions, sort of Easter eggs and stuff like that. Rob Savage, the director, even said, hey, the production designer wanted to include as many Stephen King items, throwbacks as possible, and so you can check through the whole movie that there are Stephen King stuff galore. For fans of the King, you're gonna love this movie for that, going back and looking through and trying to find all of those things in the film. So it ends up being a Stephen King's fan sort of dream here. So through it all, The Boogeyman is one of the better horror movies out there that's releasing this year. It's one of the better PG-13 horror movies out there, and through just a use of expert tension and building and building and building of just fright, it is one of the best that you can see this year. Go check out The Boogeyman on June 2nd in theaters, and you will not regret it. And if you want some more horror movie content out there, you can check out this playlist of all my movie reviews, and you can see some other great horror films in there as well.